The night was quiet when he rode back into his ranch, the stars sharp and cold above him, the moon hanging low like a silver lantern over the desert. Dust clung to his boots, and his muscles ached from days of riding fence lines, checking cattle, and fighting the loneliness that always seemed to grow heavier on him once the sun went down. He expected the silence of an empty house, the same creaking boards, the same hollow air that had greeted him every night since his wife died 3 years ago. But as he pushed open the door, something was different. The faint glow of a lamp flickered inside, the smell of smoke and sagebrush drifted through the air, and when he stepped into his bedroom, his heart froze in his chest. There, stretched across his bed as though she belonged to it, lay an Apache woman, her dark hair flowing across his pillow, her eyes closed, her breathing soft and steady, as if the house had never been empty at all. For a moment he thought he was dreaming, that the loneliness of the trail had driven him into madness, conjuring a vision his weary mind longed for. But the rise and fall of her chest was real, the faint shimmer of sweat on her skin was real, and the soft hum of breath from her lips filled the room with a warmth he hadn't known in years. He stood in the doorway, every muscle in his body tense, torn between anger at the intrusion and awe at the sight before him. She looked wild and yet delicate, dangerous yet fragile, as if her presence could shatter his world or mend it, depending on what he chose to do next. His hand hovered near his revolver, instinct whispering that an intruder meant danger, that she might be a scout, or a lure sent by raiders waiting in the hills. But another instinct, buried deeper, louder in his chest, told him to wait. Something about her didn't feel like a threat. She looked more like someone fleeing danger herself, someone who had sought shelter where no one would think to find her. Slowly, he stepped forward, the wooden floor creaking under his boots. Her eyes snapped open instantly, sharp, black, alert like a hawk's. She didn't move, didn't flinch, but he saw her muscles tense under the thin blanket, as if she were ready to spring like a mountain cat cornered in a cave. For a long moment they stared at each other, the silence between them thick with questions neither dared to speak. Finally, he broke it. "This is my home," he said quietly, his voice low, steady. Her lips parted, but she didn't look away. "And now it is mine," she replied, her voice soft but firm, carrying a weight of defiance he could not ignore. The words hit him harder than a bullet. No one had spoken to him like that in years, and certainly no woman had claimed his space, his bed, his life, with such audacity. He should have ordered her out, dragged her to the door if he had to, but something in her tone, in the fire of her eyes, held him captive. He realized then she was no ordinary runaway. She carried herself with the grace of someone born free, someone who had lived under the sky, not within walls. There was pride in the way she lay there, even in another man's house, as though she belonged wherever she chose to be. He thought of the stories he'd heard in town, whispers of Apache women stolen, sold, hunted, and yet never broken. Could she be one of them? A survivor of some raid, fleeing soldiers or bounty hunters? Questions tore through his mind, but before he could speak again, she sat up slowly, the blanket sliding from her shoulders. He swallowed hard. Her face was painted faintly with streaks of ash, her wrists bore faint red marks like those of binding ropes, and her eyes were not the eyes of someone defeated. They were the eyes of someone who had escaped. She looked at him as if measuring his soul. "If you send me out," she said, "I will not see the sunrise." There was no plea in her tone, only truth. He felt it in his bones. The land was cruel to those who had no shelter, and even crueler to a woman alone with enemies on her trail. For reasons he couldn't explain, he believed her instantly. He took a step closer, lowering his hand from the revolver. "Then stay," he answered. The words left his mouth before his mind could stop them, and in that moment, everything in his life shifted. He hadn't realized until then how hollow his home had become, how the silence of the ranch had gnawed at him night after night. Now here was a woman, fierce and unbroken, lying in the very bed he had thought he'd never share again. Something deep within him stirred, a mixture of protection, curiosity, and a dangerous pull he had no name for. She had brought not just her body into his home, but a storm of fate that already began to rattle the foundations of his quiet life. The cowboy stood there, caught between the past that haunted him and the future that now stared back at him through the eyes of an Apache woman. He knew only one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same again. Morning light crept into the room, painting the wooden walls gold, and the cowboy woke to the sound of movement beside him. For a moment, he thought he had dreamed it all, that the sight of the Apache woman in his bed was nothing but a trick of his weary mind. But when he turned his head, There she was, sitting upright, braiding her long black hair with practiced hands, her eyes sharp as they studied him without fear. She looked as though she had been awake for hours, alert to every sound, every shift of the house, every breath he took. He opened his mouth to speak, but she cut him off before he could say a word. "Your cattle are not safe," she said firmly, as though she had lived on his land all her life. He frowned, confused, but something about her tone made him sit up straight. "How do you know that?" he asked cautiously, pulling on his boots. She didn't answer right away, but her gaze drifted out the window toward the wide expanse of land stretching under the rising sun. "I heard men," she said at last, her voice low but steady. "White men, last night while you slept. They spoke of taking what is yours. They will return." Her words made his stomach tighten. Rustlers had been a plague in the territory, but he hadn't thought they'd come so close. He studied her, wondering if she was trying to trick him, but the calm fire in her eyes told him she spoke only truth. Without another word, he grabbed his rifle, the weight of it familiar in his hands, and went out into the yard. The Apache woman followed, bare feet silent against the floorboards, moving with the grace of a shadow. He didn't ask her to come, but he didn't stop her either. She belonged here now, in ways he could not explain. The two of them stood together on the porch, scanning the horizon. The land was still, but he felt her presence beside him like another weapon, another set of eyes. She was not helpless, that much he knew. She was a survivor, a fighter, and perhaps more dangerous than the men she warned him about. He found himself asking questions he hadn't dared the night before. "What's your name?" he said quietly, as though speaking too loud might break the fragile bond forming between them. She looked at him for a long time before answering. "Nayeli," she said at last, the syllables rolling from her tongue like wind over stone. He repeated it under his breath, and something about the sound anchored itself in him. Nayeli, a name that felt both foreign and necessary, like water in the desert. "And you?" she asked, her voice softer now. "What do they call you?" He hesitated, almost forgetting his own name in the strange new reality she had pulled him into. "Jesse," he said simply. That morning changed something between them. Jesse was used to silence, to days spent alone with cattle and nights echoing with his own thoughts. But Nayeli filled the silence in a way that didn't weigh on him. She moved about his kitchen, making use of herbs and cornmeal she carried in a small pouch tied at her waist. She cooked as though she belonged there, and he watched with an unshakable sense that the house itself had come alive for the first time in years. He caught himself staring more than once, and each time she met his gaze with calm defiance, reminding him she was no guest. She had claimed a place here, and deep down, he found himself grateful. Later, as the sun climbed high, Jesse saddled his horse to check the far pastures. He expected Nayeli to stay behind, but when he turned, she was already climbing up behind him, her hands resting lightly against his waist. He opened his mouth to protest, but the words never came. It felt natural, as though she had always ridden there. Together they rode out, the desert wind whipping past them, the land stretching wide and endless, but for the first time Jesse didn't feel the weight of it pressing him down. Nayeli's presence turned the emptiness into something alive, something shared. Along the fence lines they found signs, tracks in the dust, bootprints where no man should have been, broken wire where someone had cut through. Jesse cursed under his breath, anger boiling up. He had worked too hard to keep the ranch together, to let thieves take it now. Nayeli crouched low, running her fingers across the prints. "3 men," she said, her tone sharp. "1 heavy, 2 light. They will come back." Her certainty rattled him, but he didn't doubt her. She read the land the way he read the sky. She knew things no one else did, and he realized her being there was no accident. By the time they rode back, Jesse's thoughts churned like a storm. He couldn't decide if Nayeli was a blessing or a curse. She had brought danger into his home, but she had also opened his eyes to it. She was a stranger, yet somehow she knew his land better than he ever had. And though he told himself not to trust her, every time her hand brushed against his as they worked side by side, every time her dark eyes lingered on him longer than they should, he felt a pull stronger than reason. That night, as the desert cooled and the coyotes howled in the distance, Jesse sat on the porch, cleaning his rifle, when Nayeli appeared beside him. She didn't ask permission, she simply sat, her shoulder brushing his. For a long time they said nothing, the silence between them heavier than words. Finally, she spoke. "You are alone," she said simply, her voice almost a whisper. He swallowed hard, staring out into the dark. Not anymore, he answered, and the words felt like a vow. A vow he didn't yet understand, but one that bound them nonetheless. Jesse knew then that his life had already shifted. With Naeli in his home, with her shadow cast across his bed and her presence woven into his land, the old life he had lived was gone. What lay ahead, he didn't know, but he felt in his bones it would test him in ways he had never imagined. And strangely, for the first time in years, he was ready.